session at the end of our seminar. We've also sent out a feedback questionnaire as well, so if you could complete that, we really appreciate it, because that helps us going forward with future seminars. And just one final point, that if for some reason we don't have enough time to deal with all your questions and answers, then each of our speakers has said that they will email you directly. So please don't feel that if we don't get time to answer your questions, they're not going to be answered, because they definitely will. So now on to start our seminar. So our three speakers today are going to be exploring the different aspects of greenwashing. So that's going to include, what exactly does greenwashing mean? Why does it matter? Common greenwashing tactics that are being employed by some, such as green hushing, green lighting, green labelling, green crowding. And what are the risks associated with deceptive environmental claims? What's the role of the law, and what's the power of the law in terms of the legal and regulatory landscape around greenwashing, and also what are the latest developments in the regulatory landscape, and how greenwashing can undermine biodiversity and net gain efforts in several ways. So our speakers are going to provide practical insights into how to navigate this increasingly complex landscape and ensure responsible environmental practices. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, which is Professor Ian Thompson. He's a Professor of Accounting and Sustainability at the University of Birmingham. So Ian is currently Director of Centre for Responsible Business and convener of the Centre for Social and Environmental Accounting Research. He's co-author of Urgent Business: 5 Myths Businesses Have to Overcome to Save Themselves and the Planet, and the Centre's Responsible Business Learning Hub, which was highly commended in the 2023 Financial Times Responsible Business Education Award scheme. So now I'm going to pass you over to Ian.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you'll kind of give an accountant sort of a hearing in relation to kind of greenwashing. I'm going to look at this topic very much from a perspective of kind of corporate accountability practices, and it's good that my kind of fellow panelists are going to take slightly different angles. So my kind of role, I think the contribution I'm going to make is this idea of how greenwashing, what is it, the range of different practices, and certain things to look for to identify greenwashing, particularly in corporate accounting and corporate communication, and sort of like how potentially you can address some of the issues, and also some of the mechanisms in place that would allow us to have greater certainty and trust in the information that actually is actually communicated for us by different sort of organizations. So, okay, so one of the challenges of greenwashing, which is a term that's been around for a long time in academic studies of corporate kind of like reporting, has now sort of like moved into the sort of the more kind of like popular kind of discourses. And I think most recently given prevalence by Greta Thunberg at COP26, when she really sort of like talked about this kind of greenwashing, and largely it doesn't really have a sort of like a really strong, robust meaning. It's a phrase which is used in some ways. It's like kind of an empty signifier, but it's largely where you've got a disconnect between what people are saying and what people are doing. And the idea is that you're using some communication medium to present a different sort of like a different perspective of what's actually going on within an organization or related to a product or a sale. And it's also greenwashing has been, we've got kind of carbon washing, we've got sports washing. So this idea of this phrase is actually sort of like grown. Originally it kind of came in relation to environmental issues, but it's now related to anything to do with social responsibility as well as environmental issues. Now this slide, which is drawn from a kind of a reference. And if you got the slides, you click on them, it'll take you to the actual articles by some colleagues on the Network of Business Schools for Sustainability. And what they've done is they've kind of identified different categories of greenwashing. And the problem is that we've moved something from this vague statements to lies and irrelevancies. So we can see it covers a whole spectrum of different problems, different contradictions, different sort of like from false accounting to just poor accounting type practices. And we've got a whole spectrum there from vagueness, the empty claims, we are going to be wonderful in the future, selective disclosure, use of jargon, inconsistent, to really sort of like much more problematic ones about, holding out to be something different through certification and label schemes, and also just like downright lies, irrelevancies, and material misstatements. And one of the issues, I think, with the greenwashing covering such a broad range of things, it's very difficult to have a single solution. It's also a term which doesn't have a specific meaning, so it's very hard to say that somebody is or isn't sort of like greenwashing. It has to rely on other issues. Now, what's kind of quite useful is if we then look at sort of the types of greenwashing and look at the sort of solution, then we can actually start to see, well, we've got this problem vague. We've also got this, what we consider to be ungreenwashing or more kind of realistic sort of representation and accountability. And it gives us a way in which we can sort of test whether greenwashing and what type of greenwashing actually exists in there. So if we've got vagueness as one of the issues, then the solution is to avoid using unclear terms like green, eco-friendly, and support claims with evidence, and actually be very clear in the statement. So in any corporate disclosures, this relates to this product or to one product or one different range. And again, a lot of the language that's used in this space, like a green product, green doesn't mean anything. It lacks a kind of a substance. So some of these terms, which people assume has got some kind of meaning, doesn't. So you can look at the type of language that's used in corporate communications, look for the incidence of these words, and then again, it gives us a judge as to whether something's kind of greenwashing. We've got a lot of symbols, misleading, colors, pictures, and all these different things. And again, this is, often we've developed research skills where you look at corporate communication, you look at the image, you look at the words, and you look at the extent to which they're aligned. I mean, you'll kind of have lots of blue skies in kind of corporate reports. Often the text will be saying something quite specific. Oh, we had an explosion at our plant, but you've got a picture of a swan swimming on a pristine lake. And we know that that's designed to kind of manipulate and mislead people in there, particularly when people flick through reports, they often look at the pictures and they get a picture, they get a framing, and they interpret things in sort of different way. We've got inconsistent organizational practice. In particular, we're saying, oh, look, we've got one product out of a range of 1,000, or we're doing one thing in one country and we're doing something radically different in others. So we're complying with all the laws in sort of like in the UK, but then we're in breach of it in sort of like lower and middle income countries, or we're doing it in one of our branches and not others. So there's this kind of inconsistency of effectively holding out that's actually going on. So again, looking at the extent of the coverage, the use of jargon is often there. Net zero, carbon neutral, biodegradable, these sort of like phrases which have a which are almost like pseudo-scientific, often portmanteau type terms. Again, they lack a specific meaning, and it's very difficult for people to understand. And there's lots of evidence of this that's actually going on. Making statements with no proof. We are the kind of greenest of green companies. We are the best airline. We are this there. No evidence to actually to do. If there's no evidence led, again, anybody trying to interpret data, if you've not got any evidence to back up a claim, you've got to be suspicious. So look for the extent to which claims are verified and things like that. Empty claims and promises, big stuff. Look at what's actually sort of going on. Again, here's things looking at sort of like, you know, looking for overstated grand commitments or spotlighting sort of small actions that's actually there. It's quite common to find that companies are spending more money on marketing their goal than they are on achieving it, and various different things. So again, tracking off with there, and again we'll see that there's things in place that can actually start to resolve these. Selective disclosure, again, that's the thing. So again, we can again, I'll talk about how you can potentially look at the extent of the different disclosures. Lies, irrelevancies, they're hard to do, but remember that the audience is becoming more and more informed, and you've also got experts reading these reports that can actually kind of challenge things as well. The use of, you know, kind of lots of examples of companies saying we're going to be greener than green, we're going to do this, and we've got evidence that they're actually lobbying for the exact opposite. That they're kind of paying, they're participating in think tanks, they're doing different things. So again, we can look at it. And use of labels, again, it's very much a bit of a minefield. There's lots of label. Oh, look, we're sort of like certain things. We're organic. That's not enough. It's like, what type of organic are you? Is it a regular? Is it a robust label? But we've got lots of these different practices actually sort of going on. So in some ways, we need to sort of like to develop our understanding of what greenwashing is. Look for attributes of greenwashing, which these are here, and then look at what we would consider to be acceptable practice. And this allows us, if you like, to start to measure and evaluate the extent of the greenwashing that we're seeing in a particular report or what's going on. This is just a piece of work that we've been doing at Birmingham in relation to plastics. And again, it may come as a surprise that things like you often see plastics, you may well yourself have kind of like changed the way you do shopping, or you look for different packaging, use biodegradable, bioplastic, zero plastic, combustible, compostable plastic. And you kind of assume that there is something of what's biodegradable. There isn't a sort of like a strict definition of biodegradable. And in fact, actually biodegradable plastics are often a problem because it creates a problem of microplastics. So a lot of the problems we have with microplastics in our natural environment comes from creating biodegradable plastic, which basically means it breaks down in nature. But it means you can't, it doesn't mean it gets rid of the plastic, it just breaks it down into little parts that you can't scoop up and you can't clean. Compostable plastics, again, that's not bad. A lot of that's compostability is premised on industrial composting, not the compost bins that you have maybe in your sort of like back garden, because it just doesn't get to the same temperature. It needs to get up to about 50 degrees normally to actually to do these. But we've got this, these are just some examples of these things which are not sustainable, and actually they make things worse because they don't deal with the problem on a systematic basis. So these are sort of like some of the kind of, that's just one example of many that hopefully we can talk about here. The other thing with, if we go with greenwashing, we've got different attributes, but we also have different types of strategies that's actually sort of going on. So I'll just run quickly through these. Green hushing, that's basically going, shh, not mentioning it. Remember, most corporate accountability in sustainability related things relates to voluntary disclosures. So voluntary disclosures are people choosing what to say and choosing what not to say. And so sometimes there's a lot of unsaid, people not reporting certain things because they don't have to. So we've got to be quite skeptical about this. We also have the flip right now, where there's a lot of companies are doing things, but they're not actually disclosing it. And so it's difficult to make a judgment on, say, comparing different companies based on their kind of voluntary disclosures, because in some people they might be hushing up things which are actually problematic, or hushing up things which they're doing, but they're waiting until they've got proof to actually go through. And we actually have examples of kind of culture wars where companies are being attacked for being sustainable. There's the green labeling, which again mentioned, so this is often labeling the company, labeling plants, labeling projects, which can be good. There's lots of really good labels out there, but it all depends on the credibility of the labeling schemes. And we'll often see this meaningless labeling of different types of activity there. Green lighting, and this is one where a business will go, look, we've got a wonderful, we've got all these shops. Look, we've got this one here which has solar panels. It's got underfloor heating. It's got all this sort of thing. Look how wonderful we are. And what they're doing is they're actually sort of like, they're not covering the whole range of different things, and they've only got one store. And when you start looking at some of these company accounts, you see this one store coming up all the time over the last 5 years, and there's been no change anywhere else. And they're using this to distract what's actually sort of going on. The other one is green crowding, which again starts as quite subtle, and it's like where you're hiding in a group. So rather than be a company that does something on their own, you see we're taking part in an industry initiative. That can be good, but actually evidence has shown that often that's used to delay activity, and because the group then moves at the speed of the slowest adopter. And so you're using, say, well, we're not as bad as everyone else. We're maybe not good, but they're worse. So you're actually using comparators to justify and legitimate what goes on. Green shifting, we'd love to do something. You see this in lots of work. We'd love to kind of like change the way we build our house. We'd love to kind of like to move towards electric vehicles, but the consumers just don't want to buy it. And you're sort of like blame, and our suppliers can't produce that sort of thing. So it's not our fault. We're just, and in a lot of the communications, they're passing the blame on. Sometimes justified, often it's not. And it's used to legitimate existing practice. Another one is green rinsing, which is constantly changing your targets and the sort of goal. So, we're going to reduce our carbon emissions by half by 2030. We're now going to reduce it to 0 by 2050, but you don't actually report an actual progress. So you're kind of playing future targets off against which are used to disguise insufficient action. So again, these are some other things to look for when we're looking at these different things. Now, I think it's important when we're looking at sort of like greenwashing to be aware of how people perceive organizations. Now, often when we're doing sort of like company reports or corporate reports, we look at the operations, we look at the legally defined sort of structure of our organization that we believe we've got accountability for. The problem is people don't see what's that. So when people are looking at a company, they also look at their extended value chain, their suppliers, input from nature, they're getting things towards them, and then what happens afterwards and the responsibility here. So one of the real kind of like dilemmas that we have as an organization is often as organizations focus on the middle column, because that's what they feel they're accountable for. But people then engage with the company either as suppliers, either as customers, and they see these different dimensions, and they kind of like can hold a company accountable for this whole life cycle, yet the focus typically is on these different things here. So we're often talking about different kind of like issues. Again, another thing to look at is another sort of solution, if you like, to sort of greenwashing is the use of assurance. And again, so we're all kind of familiar with assurance and verification. But often a lot of people are not necessarily, although I'm hopefully talking to lawyers who do know the difference, is that just because something's verified doesn't mean you can rely on it, because there's two different types, particularly of assurance in relation to corporate disclosure. There's limited assurance, and then there's reasonable assurance. And it's important that when you're looking at something that's assured, that we're aware of how it's actually been assured. Now, limited assurance is the norm for most greenwashing disclosures and most voluntary disclosures. It relates to it's a non-statutory basis of assurance, and it's a transactional type basis. And it's very much a case of, based on the information provided by the company, we didn't come across anything to say that they were wrong, okay? And with limited assurance, you can put all sorts of caveats to that. But basically, the main story is you cannot rely on limited assurance data for any kind of like any decision. Whereas reasonable assurance, which is often used in financial reporting and is likely to be the core of the European Union Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, has a different method. It's statutory, although it can be extended on a voluntary basis. And it's very different. It's based on the procedures that we, the assurers, performed. In our opinion, what they're saying is reasonably stated. Okay. The other one is based on the information that they gave us. We can't say that they're wrong. Based on this other one, it's we can. It actually, the default position is third parties can rely on reasonably audited disclosures. So there's a difference there, but often people just assume they conflate these two different forms of assurance, and it's assured, but you've got to be really careful on what's actually kind of happening. So I'm very much conscious of time. I think I'll possibly stop there, because I think I've gone on a little bit, and then we can pass on to other presenters, and I can pick some of these other stuff up on questions. So I don't want to kind of dominate the time. Sorry, kind of Jill, but I've covered most of the things I want to cover anyway. So I shall.
Well, thank you so much, Ian. That was absolutely fascinating. And now we're going to move on to Georgie Collins. So just a very quick introduction of the time. Georgie heads up our IP and regulation management team and US desk here at Irwin Mitchell, and she advises on the protection, exploitation and infringement of brand rights worldwide. She helps clients develop their IP strategies, focusing on risk and reputation management, and she works with Irwin Mitchell's dedicated ESG team, helping our clients appropriately navigate their marketing and reporting of ESG credentials. So over to you, Georgie. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the intro, Jill, and good afternoon, everybody. Next slide, please. So just by way of introduction, the regulation in relation to green claims in the UK is an immense subject in itself. I think we'll have seen from what Ian presented just how broad-ranging and encompassing this topic is. I could devote a day at least to the regulatory aspects of green claims. So you're going to get a whistle-stop tour over the next 15 minutes of some of the key headlines that you need to be thinking about in the context of the claims your businesses may be making, or indeed your competitors, particularly if you think they should be called out in terms of the claims they are making. And that is very much a practice which is going on at the moment. So in terms of what we're seeing, some of the challenges that businesses face in terms of getting the right approach to the claims, the green related claims they're making, it is very mixed. So there's, first of all, it's not helpful that there's no single piece of legislation or even say cause of action that covers greenwashing. It's very much evolving, and it's very much a mix in terms of regulations, advertising, consumer and business protection law and regulations, as well as other guidelines and codes that bring in enforcement action around complaints. There's no, as we've seen from and heard from what Ian's had to say, there's no standard definition for the commonly used terms of greenwashing or what that means. They're multifaceted. Organisations, particularly, I'd say, we see in the manufacturing consumer spaces is being challenged by having to address the holistic approach to their life cycle in terms of particularly what goes on with their supply chain, and getting to grips with actually how complicated that is, and often the lack of visibility that there can be in getting down in a very granular way, which is what's often required relative to the claims that are being made, what that supply chain is and where it is. And compounded with all of this is just the pace and cost of change. Change is moving at a huge speed, and the cost of understanding these from a legal and regulatory perspective is significant. Next slide, please. So just to highlight, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but highlight some of the key legislation and regulation in this field. So as I mentioned, no specific cause of action under English law in relation to greenwashing, and it's a real mix of, as you'll see, different regulation with, again, different regulatory stakeholders. So to highlight the sort of the key regulations and bodies involved. So the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulation is actually quite an old regulation, dating back some decades, but it lays the fundamental principles and legal requirements which govern all advertising, marketing and commercial practices that are involved in promotion, sale or supply of products or services. So really broad ranging. It contains various prohibitions on unfair commercial practices and specific prohibitions on misleading or aggressive commercial practices, together with a list of blacklisted practices which can also attract criminal penalties. The CAP, BC CAP codes and the ASA system, as I call it. So the ASA is the UK's independent advertising regulator. It has a sister organisation, which is the Committee of Advertising Practice, referred to as CAP, which you'll often frequently see. CAP's responsible for writing the various advertising codes, and this includes, relevant to here, particularly the CAP code, which applies to non-broadcast, i.e. not TV or radio. There's different regulations that cover that, but marketing communications in the UK, which includes online, social media, print, and sets out various rules specific to environmental claims. The ASA is primarily responsible for enforcing the CAP code, and consumers and interested groups can complain to the ASA as they do when they think that there has been a breach. The ASA can't impose fines. Its rulings are public. And as a consequence, in terms of those rulings, they can be quite reputationally damaging where an organisation has been called out. And in particular, if they've had to remove an ad and a campaign. This is where we're at the moment seeing the most activity in relation to greenwashing. And I'll come on to highlight some of the cases which the ASA has been dealing with and some contrast between those decisions. The Green Claims Code. So this came out in September 21, and it followed an investigation by the Competition and Markets Authority, another body involved in relation to green claims and statements that can be made. And when they carried out this investigation, it was pretty wide-ranging. They found that around 40% of green claims made online could be misleading and therefore were falling foul of consumer legislation and misleading advertising, such as the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading regulations referred to at the beginning. So the purpose of this Green Claims Code, which came out, and I'll come on to iterate what that is in a moment, is to provide guidance and help businesses understand and comply with their responsibilities under the existing consumer protection law when they're making environmental claims. That might be the purpose. However, the nature of the claims themselves are pretty broad ranging. So you have to really be able to drill down and understand how that might permeate the claims that you're making. The code is really important. It's one of the things the ASA looks at in the context of advertising in terms of claims that are being made. And the CMA issued a warning when this code was launched that it's proactively carrying out a full review of misleading green claims, both offline and online. And that started at 2022. So the clock is really ticking in terms of how they are viewing things. The CMA have also prioritised certain industry sectors where they believe that consumers appear to be most concerned about misleading claims. So, for example, textiles and fashion, travel and transport, food and beverage, beauty and cleaning products. Just because you don't fall within those sectors, you still need to be vigilant, as the CMA has also said that any industry where it's finding significant concerns will become a priority on its list. The CMA has already launched investigations into green claims made by ASOS, Boohoo and George at Asda in relation to statements and languages they've used, which the CMA considers are too broad and vague, and essentially create the impression that certain of their clothing collections are more environmentally sustainable than they actually are. So they are very much the eyes and ears of what's going on in terms of what businesses are saying, and will be calling them out by way of example if their investigations are found to show that claims have been made that shouldn't have been. More recently, we've had the Advertising Standards Agency issue the Misleading Environmental Claims and Social Responsibility Guidance. It develops the guidance that we have already. It builds on the Green Claims Code, but it consolidates a number of those regulations. It doesn't supersede them, but it gives some very helpful examples of where green claims will fall foul of the Green Claims Code, or say the CAP Code. And I'll come on to explain a little bit more of that in a moment with some examples. Looking at who are the enforcers, so you've got the Competition and Markets Authority, the Advertising Standards Authority and Trading Standards. Typically, the advertising issues and how they are dealt with falls to the ASA, who, as I say, have been increasingly active in clamping down on green claims. The ASA's powers are limited, so they can't issue proceedings, they can't issue fines. The CMA also has no direct power to fine companies. They'd have to take an organisation to court and prove some sort of breach of consumer law in order to impose a civil penalty. And the CMA's enforcement activity is more typically directed in the realm of anti-competitive behaviour, although that could be due for a change based on a new bill which is going through Parliament at the moment. Again, more on that in a second. Trading standards can also enforce in relation to consumer protection regulations where there's particularly criminal aspects, but again, that is rare. So most of it is falling at the door of the ASA. Other arenas where we are seeing development and may start to follow the trajectory of certainly what we've seen in the US, which is shareholder activism and derivative claims. So Climate, very well publicised, took action against Shell. The case was groundbreaking. It was the first ever climate litigation case to try and use a derivative action to establish the personal liability of a company's directors for allegedly failing to address the threat of climate change. As I say, shareholder activism is big in the US. We haven't seen that style of litigation here in the UK. But despite the fact that Climate's claim failed, the court accepted that they had established a prima facie case and said that Shell faces material and foreseeable risks as a result of climate change, which have or could have a material effect on it. And I think the court's finding won't be lost on others in terms of those sort of shareholder activism type claims in looking to bring ESG claims. So that is a development and one to watch, where you have those big prominent public organisations, particularly in the energy space. In terms of what's on the horizon and coming your way that you need to think about and start to plan for. So the Financial Conduct Authority has also recently proposed new rules looking to come in from 2024 around investment funds and their managers to prevent consumers being led by greenwashing and green claims that are being made around things like ethical funds when they're not. The FCA has completed a consultation on a whole range of rules to address greenwashing, and it's anticipated that that's going to be finalised at some point mid this year, including a general anti-greenwashing rule. We then have the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Bill, which was put to Parliament last month, and amongst other things, because it doesn't just address this realm around greenwashing, but it's a consultation on potentially increasing and having additional powers for the Competition and Markets Authority, which may include its ability to levy fines without pursuing an organisation through the courts. And in the context of those types of fines, they could be significant. The discussions have been that they're kind of on a GDPR type scale, so looking at a percentage of global turnover where there have been misleading green claims. So one to watch as that passes through Parliament, with the anticipated date of coming into force, assuming it's passed, spring next year. A couple of other pieces of legislation, the EU Green Claims Guide. So the EU will be shortly presenting a draft Green Claims Directive that's going to set out detailed requirements for the substantiation and communication of environmental claims. And then there is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Guide, which is designed to ensure that there's better, more in-depth and comparable reporting on sustainability matters. Links back to what Ian was raising at the beginning in terms of reporting. It's intended to come into effect from 2024, and it does vary depending on the size of the company, so larger organisations. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just turning to the detail of the Green Claims Code and what the substance of what is in that code. The points are at a fairly high level. So claims must be truthful and accurate. So, you know, businesses have to live up to the claims they make about their product, their services, brands and activities. Claims have to be clear and unambiguous. So products messaging and its credentials should match. Claims must not omit or hide important information. So advertising can't offer consumers selective information, which it frequently does. Claims must be fair and meaningful, so comparisons have got to compare like with like. Claims have got to be substantiated. Again, Ian talked about this and how you might go about doing this. So they've got to be supported by robust, credible and up-to-date evidence. And sometimes that can be difficult for organisations to amass that, particularly larger organisations, and substantiating their claims, particularly when it relates to the supply chain. Claims must consider the full life cycle of the product or service. So you can't just pick a particular point that's favourable to you as an organisation. And again, that regularly comes out when organisations have been called out, and in relation to the ES rulings about that advertising, which has to stop. And in relation to these claims, organisations will often fall short on a number of these claims. It's not just one of them. Next slide, please. So just coming on to, this is very recent, this guidance and from this month. So in relation to misleading environmental claims and social responsibility, it's nothing new, but it really develops the ASA's position in relation to misleading environmental claims and social responsibility, for which it had issued guidance back in 2021. What it's really done is taken account of some recent ASA decisions, particularly involving energy companies, airlines and utilities, and given some useful guidance in terms of the types of claims which are likely to mislead or where significant information is admitted. And it's referred to other rulings within the ASA too, and develop the point. So it gives you a bit more instruction if you're sitting there looking at the claims that you might be making, of where you may stray into difficulty or be caught out. But it doesn't give you a list, like, for example, the Green Claims Code does. It's a detailed document that you need to work through, and you've got to given some indication there in terms of how it's developing the points that's been made in the Green Claims Code and also the CAP code. I'm going to give some recent examples of what has been going on at the ASA. Can I have the next slide, please? Just conscious of time. So the first image you see is in relation to Lufthansa. And as part of its Make Change Fly campaign, they featured this ad and the slogan that said, "Connecting the world, protecting its future." And the ASA ruled that the ad couldn't run in the UK because there were no currently environmental initiatives or actually commercially viable technologies in the aviation industry which would substantiate the absolute green claim that they were protecting the world's future. The next example you see is an extract of what appeared on YouTube and was Unilever promoting its personal laundry product with the slogan, "Touch on stains, kinder to our planet." The detergent works well in a cold, quick wash, according to the ad, and the bottle is made from 50% recycled plastic, excluding the cap and the label. The ASA told Unilever that kinder, the word, was an unclear claim because the ad offered no basis of comparison, and also said that Unilever had failed to explain the impact of the entire life cycle of its product, both from manufacturing to use to disposal. And then the other image you see, the tree. So a company called Evergreens claimed its plastic grass was eco-friendly, with benefits comparable to the air purifying effects of one mature tree. The ASA said that the grass being plastic overruled any benefits from transporting it in a more efficient way or exploring recycling options, adding that Evergreens did not have enough evidence to make the mature tree comparison. There's a number of really high profile examples on the ASA's website in terms of the rulings that they have made of global organisations who, in terms of the claims they've made, have had to withdraw them, cease using them. And, you know, in certain circumstances, that's extremely costly in terms of the scale of those campaigns and how they're rolled out and put together. It's not the fact that the ASA doesn't necessarily have the teeth to levy fines, the fact that there can be a complaint upheld and as a consequence a very large piece of marketing activity has to be pulled is not insignificant for even a large corporate organisation. I'm going to pull together two contrasting cases. Next slide, please. And again, these can concern two recent decisions concerning water authorities, Anglian Water and Severn Trent. And you've got details there of what was said. They were both in print and one was kind of voice on demand as well. So multimedia in terms of how these advertisements were presented. The claims and the issues in both cases were similar. Interestingly, slightly worryingly too, both ads had been approved and cleared in advance by specialist agency in advertising claims that helps organisations work through what they're doing relative to this regulatory environment that we've been talking about. Both of the ads omitted information about the advertiser's overall impact on the environment. But what the differences were between the cases in terms of the complaint that was upheld against Anglian Water compared to the complaint that wasn't against Severn Trent was, so in relation to Anglian Water, the ASA identified them as having been a relatively poorly performing company compared with industry standards and relative to other companies in that sector, with relatively recent instances of financial penalties and sanctions for negatively impacting the environment. So the ASA's view was that it was misleading for them to leave out this past history. In comparison, Severn Trent was a relatively high performing company compared with certain industry standards and relative to other companies in the sector, with fewer instances of penalties and sanctions imposing it for negatively impacting the environment. So the ASA thought it was acceptable for them to leave out their past history. really difficult, you could imagine, for Anglian Water seeing that compared to Severn Trent, and the level of detail that's required to look behind the claims that are being made, which will determine whether you'll find you're on the right side of the ASA or not. Just to give some final context in relation to the ASA's ruling, its activity and how companies are faring. Over the past year, it's had 322 complaints. Of those, it's upheld 282, not upheld 25, and upheld in part 15. So I think that gives a very strong sense of the direction of travel, where the ASA is at in relation to the complaints that are hitting its organisation. As I said, some of its rulings have involved global corporates and their advertising campaigns, which have been produced at very significant expense and which will have to have been withdrawn where a complaint has been upheld. In addition to getting your own house in order, as I mentioned at the beginning, what we're also seeing is companies who are particularly in competitive sectors which are challenged, who are monitoring what their competitors are saying and the claims they are making. And a quick skim through the ASA rulings, which is actually quite interesting just to see who is featuring on the ASA's list and who's made the complaints, will reveal where a competitor company has made a complaint. It doesn't reveal where consumers have made complaints, the details of those, but it does where a competitor has. So some interesting intel there. Looking at the clock, I'm going to pause there and pass to the next speaker. Jill, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Georgie. That was a really interesting explanation around the legal and regulatory landscape of greenwashing, which sounds extremely complex. But thank you for making that sound much more simpler, if that's the right word to use. And so we're going to move on quickly now to Sinead Davis, and I'm going to introduce Sinead. She's a planning and environmental barrister at No. 5 Chambers and specialises in commercial residential developers, government bodies, and has advised Welsh ministers as well as NGOs and third parties on all aspects of the development life cycle, and in particular on matters with environmental law and regulation. So over to you, Sinead. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jill, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see so many people on the call. As Jill has mentioned, most of my time really is spent advising either promoters of projects on renewable energy, commercial or residential developments, but also advising them increasingly on points of environmental law, including how projects can be effectively and more legitimately offset. So today I'm here to guide you through the minefield that is understanding any form of project that you're involved with where there may be natural capital at stake and where you are in effect offsetting, given that that increasingly forms an important part of ESG strategies. Next slide, please. So why are we talking about offsets in particular, or natural capital? Well, natural capital, as I've said, is an increasingly important part of companies' ESG portfolios. You may recall that Brewdog, for example, had some controversy about its lost forest. We've seen the likes of ASOS billionaire Anders Povsson investing wealth in rewilding and conservation tourism, heavily culling deer, abandoning grouse shooting, and all to promote natural regeneration. We've also seen the likes of Heathrow Airport investing heavily in peatland restoration, and other corporations, including Aviva and Standard Life, have bought land purely to plant forests and restore peatland, and we're seeing similar activity across the biodiversity space too. Next slide, please. So what types of natural capital expenditure are we seeing? Well, we're seeing increasingly carbon and biodiversity credits, as they are being called, philanthropy and corporate social responsibility programs dedicated to increasing biodiversity or carbon sequestration. We're seeing the evolution of new markets for ecosystem services on a voluntary basis, peatlands, biodiversity, for example, and indeed for green bonds. So why should we be thinking about this? Well, some of it is what we're calling defensive expenditure, like protecting freshwater sources to avoid future costs. We see sometimes investment into crop pollination to enable or increase traditional economic activity, particularly where you're reliant on pollination. But as I've already said, increasingly we're seeing the transfer of capital for largely ESG or CSR purposes. So why should we be concerned? Next slide, please. So Georgie's already alluded to the significant reputational risk arising from false claims around advertising in particular. But that reputational risk doesn't often stop at your own operations as a company, and Georgie's referred to the complexities regarding supply chains in particular. Increasingly, there are a huge number of stakeholders involved in delivering the carbon ambitions or biodiversity ambitions of any given company. You might, for example, for the first time have landowners or middlemen involved in managing carbon or biodiversity projects on behalf of the company. And we've seen how this has played out in the corporate space. We've noted, for example, that Vera, which is a world-leading carbon standard for voluntary carbon offsets, as reported by The Guardian, were found to have been selling phantom credits for offsetting into carbon sinks, woodland carbon sinks. And Shell, famously, as I think George has already alluded to, were found by the ASA to have misled consumers regarding the Shell Go loyalty scheme and carbon offsetting again in that regard. So is it only reputation that we need to be concerned about? Well, increasingly, we also need to be concerned about legal risk. Next slide, please. There has been a rise in climate litigation or climate-related litigation. Not all of this is greenwashing or climate washing, but there has been a significant rise in litigation since the Paris Agreement. 240 cases, as referred to by the Grantham Institute and published just this week, or at least this month, I believe. The latest word on how many cases there have been concerning the climate. And a number of those, and an increasing number, have referred to climate washing. Next slide, please. So how can we go about combating this? Well, I think from my point of view, monitoring, reporting and verification is a really, really important limb to help understand the extent to which the claims being made, not only by you, but also by people on whom you're relying for these types of natural capital projects, are indeed true. So you might ask, why does it matter? Well, it matters largely because failure to have proper MRV means that decarbonisation can be hampered. It can be it can be the case that the claims that you're making are not fully true. And obviously this can have knock-on implications for reputational and legal risk, as I've already alluded to. I've also explained why MRV is important, and that's because there is an increasing number of stakeholders in the game. You have landowners who may be managing the land, regulators, for example, the Environment Agency or Natural England. You may have local authorities who are dealing with, increasingly dealing with areas of biodiversity net gain. You may have intermediaries, organisations who claim to be able to rate or evaluate particular projects, who may be able to who may be making claims about particular projects. Plainly, you have corporates interested in this space, and also charities who may be managing projects. For example, Wildlife Trust are increasingly taking on projects for more corporate organisations. Obviously, commitments are on the rise, and when commitments are on the rise, there's greater interest in this space, and integrity becomes even more important when projects may be being sold to corporates in an increasingly commonplace way. And finally, then, just it's important, MRV is important for ensuring that the claims that you make indeed are holding true. Next slide, please. So Ian has already referred to the different types of greenwashing, and I thought I would just bring this slide back up just so that we can turn our minds to how greenwashing might play out in the natural capital space. So you might have unclear language, for example, on how you have offset your emissions, as it might be said. Are you really just planting one tree for the flight that you might be taking across the world? There's complete lack of clarity, for example, on the language that's being used. And Georgie has explained how lack of clarity means that you often run into trouble with the ASA. Where there's no backup for the claims that you're making. So if if an auditor or a reporter were to come and really look at the project that you have invested in, is there actually backup? Is there evidence that the claims that you're making that lead to carbon neutrality or biodiversity net gain are indeed true? Who is it that's making the claims? Are they verified by a third party who might be able to provide some kind of assurance or corroboration that the claims that you're making are true about the type of project that you might be investing in? The Green Claims Code is really helpful in that regard, so helping you to turn your mind to the considerations that the Green Claims Code have encapsulated, just to help you really think carefully about whether or not all the questions around natural capital projects that you may be investing in have been answered. Next slide, please. Okay, so next slide. So in particular, the challenges around carbon, it's important to have regard to scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So scope 1 emissions are direct emissions resulting from your company-owned machinery, facilities and vehicles, indirect from electricity, heat, steam, for example, that you may have purchased, and increasingly scope 3 emissions, which are those which are indirect. So the starting point is, can you really say you're carbon neutral without having turned your mind to the complete carbon profile of your company, including the way, for example, employees come to work, and other kind of scope 3 emissions, which you might not immediately think about when evaluating the carbon performance of your company. Similarly, it's also important to have regard to scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions when you're thinking about the natural capital projects that you might also be investing in. So is there machinery, for example, that is running the operation, and how do you quantify that? Next slide, please. Secondly, then there's a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace. So again, this largely comes back to the fact that there are many different stakeholders involved, all of whom have got different stakeholder interests in this game. There's a lot of uncertainty, and there's inherent uncertainty in dealing with what are often natural products, trees, wetlands, peatlands, biodiversity net gain sites. They're all inherently quite unpredictable beasts to be working with. So making sure that you're building in that kind of uncertainty into the claims that you're making is really important. Thirdly, then, permanence. Permanence is effectively the risk that emissions reductions achieved through the offset project may not be sustained over the long term. That might be a risk of reversal, a deforestation project, for example, where you've planted lots of trees, and how are you really and seriously going to be sure that the value that you've captured is actually going to be sustained over the long term? So permanence is a really important feature, again, to bear in mind when you're making green claims. Next slide, please. We then have additionality. So additionality is about assessing whether an offset project is truly additional and requires a reliable methodology and assessment of the baseline. So is what you're doing above and beyond what would have happened in a no investment or no development scenario? That's particularly important in situations where the emissions reductions might already be mandated by regulations. So think very carefully about whether what you're investing in actually is going above and beyond what would have happened had you not been investing in that natural capital. The next one is quality and credibility. So there are an increasing number of players in the market who are making claims about the particular standard of the natural capital project, and ensuring the quality and credibility of the offset project is essential in order to maintain the trust in the market. Poorly designed or implemented projects can undermine the environmental integrity of the offset project in particular. And whilst third-party auditing companies or standards can help with that, they may not always be the full answer, given all the challenges I've already explained. Next slide, please. You may also have leakage. So leakage is when emissions reductions in one area result in those emissions just shifting elsewhere. So you might take land out of production in one area, but it might mean that land is used for a more environmentally harmful purpose somewhere else. So leakage is something to be alive to as well. And then finally, double counting. So increasingly in a market where there's so much demand for these types of natural capital projects, Double counting is something to be really alive to. So making sure that the person that you're buying from isn't selling it on again to not only you but a whole host of other corporate players in the market. Next slide, please. So what's being done to help combat this? Well, there are some of the original players in the game. The Woodland Carbon Code is the assurance standard for woodland creation projects in the UK. It helps generate high integrity, independently verified carbon units. It is backed by government and the forestry industry, as well as carbon market experts. The peatland code, similarly, we're seeing a whole host of projects come forward through that initiative too. More generally, I think it's worth saying that there is, generally speaking, a flight to quality happening at the moment, given the demand for these types of projects. We are seeing increasing demand for rating organisations who are able to hone in on those projects which are of a higher quality removal. They may offer co-benefits, so other benefits alongside the carbon benefits. It's worth saying that lots of those companies do map these projects from a distance, so maybe from satellite imagery, for example. And again, all of these come with a whole host of uncertainties. All of those I've already described, and it's important that the claims that you're making about what these projects can and can't do are framed with those kinds of levels of uncertainty in mind. Next slide, please. So just finally then, what's going on in the planning and development space, which is the space I spend most of my time working in. And I think this is important because it's a good example of monitoring, reporting and verification in practice. So there's mandatory biodiversity net gain coming in November of 2023 for most planning projects. Natural England have come up with a biodiversity net gain metric, what we're calling a monitoring, reporting and verification tool. They've already indicated that it cannot be used with voluntary carbon credits, so the land that's used for biodiversity net gain cannot be double counted. And what do we do about permanence, you might say, and how do we know that these projects are going to be sustained over the longer term? Well, the development industry's current answer to that is through conservation covenants and Section 106 agreements, which are not just a contractual instrument, they are instruments that run with the land. So Section 106 agreements not only bind the person who may be on the land at that time, but also their successors in title. So a much more powerful instrument to explain to a regulator how you're overcoming issues of permanence. Again, potentially not the golden standard, but a good example of how the MRV is being played out in practice. Next slide, please. So what are the takeaways? Well, there's a huge amount of activity going on in this space. I think all the other speakers highlighted how it's really, really important to take due diligence very, very seriously indeed. Georgie's highlighted in particular how taking due diligence seriously regarding claims that you're making is of paramount importance, and I've sort of highlighted on how it's important that those claims are also carried through into projects that you may be aligning yourself with. Make sure you're cautious about embracing those projects, but equally they're a very exciting opportunity and an important part of many companies' decarbonisation strategies. I think the important message to bear in mind is don't sell it too high and be really, really careful and considered in your due diligence, so that the claims that you are ultimately making about offsetting, for example, or net gains in biodiversity are indeed as true as they possibly can be based on the evidence that you have before you. And finally, then tread carefully and seek advice whenever it's needed. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you so much, Sinead. That was absolutely fascinating, and I hope you've all very much enjoyed hearing from our three speakers on such a wide range of issues relating to greenwashing. It's quite an area for businesses to navigate around, and I hope that you go away from today's talk with a lot more understanding of issues that your business may face. So please feel free to put any questions in the chat box. We've only got one question at the moment, and also please feel free to email any of our speakers if you have any queries that we don't have time to, or you haven't thought about today, because they've said that they would definitely be pleased to address any questions that you have. So we've got one question in the chat box, and that's from Becky Hunt, and she has asked, has there been any legislation in the UK in relation to business claims? I'm not sure who would want to take that question.
I will, Jill.
Georgie? Thank
Yeah,
you.
I will do. And actually, I should have included that on my slide. So thank you for picking that up, Becky. So yes, there absolutely is. And predominantly it is the business protection from misleading marketing regulations. It kind of mirrors the consumer code in that way. But what it relates to is directly business to business and is really quite targeted at seeking to prevent competitors getting an unfair advantage through the use of misleading advertisements or copycat products, for example. It's often used in the context of comparative advertising or critiques by one business of another in terms of what they're doing, which might then change, particularly the behaviour of a consumer in terms of how they purchase those products. So yes, there is that legislation.
Thank you. I don't think we've got any more questions from anyone, but happy to, if you want to just put them in the chat box, or haven't seen any. Jessica, have we got any more questions? She's just responding. No more questions. So just take this opportunity again to say a big thank you to Georgie, to Ian and to Sinead for giving up your time today to come and talk to us, and thank you all so much for attending, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.